Today's video is sponsored by Morning Brew. Morning Brew is a totally free newsletter, and just like a rich cup of coffee, is something that you'll want to start your day with. It's a quick, well-organized look at light and heavy news that you can receive every day, Monday through Saturday. And I'm telling you, it's pretty excellent. Who's got the time to sit down and watch the news every morning? Who has the stamina to slog through a dry, crusty news section in your local newspaper every single day? Who trusts that Twitter is going to vomit up the topics that you definitely need to know about? It's not. Morning Brew tells me what I need to know, along with some really cool or interesting tidbits that you can keep in your back pocket as a bit of a conversation starter. For instance, earlier today, the day of recording, I was reading my most recent copy, recording this late November, and it's got all these good bite-sized bits of information. It's got a short explanation of how more than 4 million Americans quit their job in September, which, as you might imagine, is a record number of people. It's also got an update on the Theranos trial, a prediction on a potential Cold War between Amazon and Visa, and an absolutely crazy story about how El Salvador announced plans for a Bitcoin city with an energy grid powered by a volcano. It sounds like a James Bond villain. It's a good read. So yes, if you like finance, current events, or tech, or if you just want to keep up with some basic headlines, there's absolutely no reason not to subscribe to Morning Brew. It's free. It takes 10 seconds. There's a link below. And now today's video. In 1939, as Europe stood on the brink of a murky future, a chance find transformed our understanding of the continent's past. At Sutton Hoo in East Anglia, a self-trained archaeologist and a rich widow excavated a suspicious mound. Inside they found treasure that reflected so brightly its light would dispel the myth of the Dark Ages. Buried in this rich acidic soil were the remnants of an ancient vessel, a 27-meter behemoth that had once ploughed the waves of the North Sea. Now repurposed as a tomb, it stood above a burial chamber filled with objects of unparalleled richness. Yet it wasn't the contents of this ancient grave that made it so special, but its age. Dating back over 1,300 years, it hailed from a period that had almost been lost to history, a period in Britain's past that stood between the departure of the Romans and the arrival of the Vikings. The era of the Anglo-Saxons. Long thought to have been an age of barbarism, Sutton Hoo reveals the period to have been as complex and vibrant as anything that had come before. Today we're telling the tale of the archaeological dig that illuminated the Dark Ages. 14 centuries ago, a great ceremony took place unlike anything the Kingdom of East Anglia had ever seen. On the River Deben, a vast crowd gathered. Under the grey skies, they worked as one to haul a vast ship up a slope onto the bluff overlooking the river. There they buried it, along with a soul body, a grand pagan ritual that was doubtless attended by those from all across this ancient land. But despite the exhausting work gone into the burial, despite the clear renown of the deceased, it would leave almost no trace on history. As the centuries slipped by, the eerie, complex society within which it took place would be semi-forgotten, leaving only a blank in the historical record and public imagination. A blank that would become known as the Dark Ages. And it would only be with the discovery of Sutton Hoo that we rediscovered how sophisticated the Anglo-Saxons really were. The arrival of the Angles and the Saxons in Britain was made possible only by the collapse of an old empire. In 410 AD, the Romans had finally been all like, you know what, screw this rainy island, and abandoned their northernmost province. Into the void left behind by their exit came diverse groups of Germanic peoples who'd eventually form a common culture known as the Anglo-Saxons. Yet while they established 7 kingdoms on the islands, known collectively as the Heptarchy, they weren't an insular British culture. Those in the Kingdom of East Anglia, for example, kept far closer connections to Scandinavia than they did to other parts of Britain. For them, groups living in modern Sweden or Denmark would have felt like neighbours, while those living in what is today Cornwall would have seemed like distant, pasty-obsessed aliens. So while pretty much this entire video takes place within England, it doesn't really make sense to think of it as solely a piece of English history. Instead, Sutton Hoo is perhaps better understood as a fragment of a piece of much larger history, one encompassing much of Northern Europe. And it would be events in Europe that led to this era becoming so forgotten. In the years and centuries following the great ship burial at Sutton Hoo, 2 important things happened. that transformed the region. The first was the arrival of Christianity. In 596, Pope Gregory sent missionaries to Britain to convert the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, a move that would eventually turn the Sutton Hoo burial site into a place shunned as irredeemably pagan. The second, more important event was the arrival of the Vikings. From the late 8th century on, Viking raids smashed centers of power up and down the British coast, devastating monasteries. Since the monasteries tended to be where all the records were held, that meant a crazy amount of Anglo-Saxon history just went up in flames. While some texts would survive, such as Bede's writings, the scale of loss would leave a black hole in the historical record, one so vast that before long, nearly everything about the people who'd buried their ship at Sutton Hoo would be forgotten. With that forgetting came physical destruction. The next millennia saw the Sutton Hoo site treated with about as much respect as the internet treats Florida Man. In the Middle Ages, people used the mounds as quarries. In the Tudor era, gentlemen grave robbers dug up priceless artifacts, melted them down, and split their cash value with the king. By the time the 20th century dawned, both Sutton Hoo itself and the era that spawned it had been more or less forgotten, consigned to the memory hole of history. Little did anyone realize, hidden just below the ground lay a great treasure, one capable of changing everything. Thankfully, the right people would soon be on hand to find it. One of the consistently pleasing things about doing these videos is finding out just how often some major discovery rests on sheer chance. For instance, had Edith Pretty not been widowed and looking to distract herself from her grief, it's likely we'd never have found out what was buried at Sutton Hoo. The daughter of wealthy parents, Pretty had spent part of her younger years observing digs in remote corners of the world and was fascinated by archaeology. She also had an adventurous side. During World War I, she'd volunteered at a hospital near the front, later marrying the soldier, Major Frank Pretty. The two had moved into the Sutton Hoo estate in 1926, settling in this vast home that gazed across a series of ancient mounds towards the River Deben. It was only after Frank died in 1934 that Pretty began to get obsessed with those mounds. She began to wonder if they really were of Roman origin, as everyone claimed. In 1937, she decided that she needed to investigate. That summer, Edith Pretty attended a flower show in nearby Woodbridge, where she got introduced to a local history buff who, in turn, introduced her to the head of the Ipswich Museum, who, in turn, introduced her to Basil Brown. A local self-taught archaeologist, Brown was the kind of fascinating oddball who so often crops up in these kind of stories. Someone as knowledgeable as they were fiercely independent. For instance, while you or I might decide to learn about astronomy by taking a course, Brown was all like, adult education, that's for chumps. So he bought a telescope and proceeded to make such detailed amateur observations that he was able to publish a book on the subject. By 1937, though, his main gig was digging stuff up for the Ipswich Museum on a freelance basis. So when Pretty asked if he'd like to come and dig up her land and find some cool stuff, he was more than happy to oblige. Not that cool stuff was what they initially found. In return for 30 shillings a week and free accommodation, Basil Brown began digging on the 20th of June 1938. The early going was not super encouraging. As Brown dug into the first of the three mounds Pretty wanted explored, he again and again only found evidence that grave robbers had beaten him to it centuries earlier. It wasn't a total bust or anything. There were some ancient iron rivets, some fragments of pottery, bits of an old axe, stuff like that. But while such bits and bobs might be thrilling for experts, they're absolutely not the sort of find you can spin off into a 23-minute YouTube video. Still, what Brown uncovered was enough for Pretty to ask him to return the following summer, this time to tackle the biggest mound of all of them. Known today as Mound Number 1, this strange hill doesn't look like anything much on Google Images, a tiny hillock poking up out of the flat ground. In person, though, it seemed gigantic. Brown cheerily recalled that it felt like digging into a small mountain. Still, in May 1939, he and Pretty's gamekeeper William Spooner and gardener John Jacobs got to work excavating that ancient mountain. Within just 3 days, Brown had realized that this year's dig would be something special. That day, Jacobs let out a cry. Running over, Brown had found a small lump of iron, something his trained eye immediately recognized as a rivet from a ship. Thankfully, Brown was professional enough that he didn't let the excitement go to his head. He and his team kept carefully, methodically working, clearing away the soil, painstakingly searching for the traces of what lay beneath. What they found went beyond their wildest dreams. By early June, it was clear a giant boat had once been buried here, a boat that by now had completely rotted away, but still left a visible imprint in the soil, a ghostly negative image of an object from the distant past. And if that imprint was still here, undisturbed by grave robbers, that left a tantalizing possibility. The treasures buried alongside it might still be here too. In 1946, the British Museum would note that before Sutton Hoo, the known remnants of the Anglo-Saxon era comprised nothing larger than a bucket or longer than a sword. So the mere fact that the outline of a 27-meter boat had been uncovered was enough to make everybody sit up and take notice. On June the 6th, the first of those experts turned up at the estate, the professional archaeologist Charles Phillips. If your knowledge of Sutton Hoo comes purely from Netflix's otherwise excellent film The Dig, you might be under the impression that Phillips was a bit of a prat, a guy who came swanning in after Brown had done all of the hard work and then gobbled up most of the credit. While it's true that Phillips did take over the excavations, the tension between him and Brown was mostly played up for dramatic effect. For all Basil Brown may have been outside archaeology's elite circles, even professional 1930s stuffed shirts could see that he'd done a hell of a job that earned him Phillips's respect. And regardless, it was still Brown who made the greatest find of all. About a week after Phillips first came to the site, but before he took over the project, Brown was working late. It was a classic summer evening in northern Europe, with the light only fading into a warm dusk long after most respectable folk are already ensconced in the pub with a gallon of cider. But rather than getting tanked in the interwar equivalent of Weatherspoons, Brown was hard at work in the dimming light excavating the mound. That evening he was alone, so no one was able to record his expression as he uncovered the iron ring nor the decaying box that it was attached to. A box that would soon turn out to contain artifacts so grand that the Sutton Hoo site would become known as Britain's Valley of the Kings after Egypt's Luxor. And the luckiest part? Brown could still see the outlines of a previous trench dug by grave robbers many decades earlier, one that had come within inches of finding the treasure box, only to stop just short. Just think of the luck involved. If that one grave robber hadn't gotten spooked or been too damn lazy, there would have been nothing left for Brown, Pretty, and Phillips to uncover. As it was, they were able to present the world with the greatest single find in British archaeological history. Down within the ghost image of the boat, some 263 separate objects lay, awaiting discovery. There were items made of gold, of silver, and bronze, of enamel, of iron, from textiles. There were gemstones, coins, weapons, musical instruments, items of clothing. It was quite simply the greatest haul of Anglo-Saxon artifacts ever excavated, an eerie time capsule from a forgotten time. But while the value of these objects was notable, money alone wasn't the main reason archaeologists still freak out about Sutton Hoo today. Rather than pure dollar value, it would be what those 263 objects represented that soon shook the world. Even if you know next to nothing about the Anglo-Saxons and think Sutton Hoo is a kind of pudding that posh British people eat, you'll likely already know the Sutton Hoo Helmet. Retrieved from the dig site in tiny fragments and painfully reassembled, it's one of the most iconic finds of 20th century archaeology. A worn, damaged piece that nonetheless showcases incredible craftsmanship. It's this last point that makes Sutton Hoo so important. In the intricate designs of each piece Brown and Pretty found, we can see reflected an entire age of artisans, of a level of skill no one in Britain had ever thought their forebears capable of. But then it turned out that the Anglo-Saxons were full of surprises. Although seemingly the grave of warrior chieftain, the Sutton Hoo dig didn't just uncover weapons and fancy helmets. There were ostentatious displays of wealth, like gorgeous silver bowls and a belt buckle made of forged gold. There were artistic treasures too, like a lyre and the remnants of delicately woven textiles, objects meant to show not just the dead man's strength, but also his learning. There were shoulder clasps intended to invoke those once worn by Roman emperors, drinking horns for partying in the afterlife, a purse filled with 40 gold coins for paying off the ferryman that would take him to that undiscovered country. In short, this was the tomb not of some prehistoric Biff Tannen farting and grunting around a dark and ignorant age, but of a king or warrior on par with any of Britain's future monarchs. It was also the tomb of someone at the heart of a deeply interconnected world. Because Britain is an island, all of us Brits like to buy into that stereotype of our country eternally existing in splendid isolation, somehow forever detached from continental affairs. Obviously, this has always been romantic hogwash. Just look at the Norman Conquest, or the Glorious Revolution, or our bad habit of treating Ireland as little more than a handy potato field. Still, the find at Sutton Hoo showed the Anglo-Saxons were far more connected to the rest of the world than historians could have ever guessed. There were objects from Scandinavia, coins from France, but the treasures went beyond just the borders of Europe. One of the silver bowls seemed to have travelled all the way from distant Constantinople, then the heart of the Byzantine Empire. Textiles seemed to come from Syria. A dish is thought to be Egyptian. There were even gemstones that are thought to be Sri Lankan, meaning they travelled a distance of nearly 9,000 kilometres to be buried there. Now, did this mean the Anglo-Saxons were personally swanning around the Indian Ocean loading up on souvenirs? Well, no, but it did show that the Kingdom of East Anglia was plugged into a world that was as vast and as alive after the fall of Rome as it had ever been. Look, I know I keep banging on about this, but honestly, prior to Sutton Hoo, people's mental timeline ran something like this. Ancient Greece, Roman Empire, empty stupid bit where nothing happened and people probably ate their own shit, Viking raids, Norman conquest, tea, and the Empire. Now, thanks to the work of Basil Brown and Edith Pretty, people could see that that wasn't the case, that the descriptions of grand burials and rich culture in surviving texts like Beowulf weren't just fantasy, but they were based on history. Yet, for all it showed us, there was one major question about Sutton Hoo that we'd never learn the definitive answer to. A question we're still wrestling with to this very day. Whose grave was it? Because it stood on Britain's east coast, the Kingdom of East Anglia was one of the worst hit by Viking raids. That meant it lost a terrific amount of records, turning any hope we had of understanding this era into so much smoke. That being said, not everything burned, and thanks to some finds in Mound 1 itself, we can even estimate the general year of the burial. The biggest clue we have are the coins. With a few dozen found at Sutton Hoo, the newest one dating from 625 AD, it seems reasonable to assume this burial took place around this time. We also know that it came at a time of profound religious change. Among the artifacts uncovered are silver bowls with cross-shaped designs and engraved names that appear to be a reference to the biblical figure St. Paul. Combined with the pagan style of the burial, this suggests the buried man was interred just as Christianity was starting to spread its wings in the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, at a moment on the cusp of epoch-shattering change. All of which has led many scholars over the years to suggest the tomb once contained King Raedwald. From a line of rulers who were said to be descended from the grave of the great god Woden, Raedwald ruled the Kingdom of East Anglia between 599 and 624 AD. He's also said to have converted to Christianity while in the Kingdom of Kent, only to have a change of heart on his return home, something that might account for the mix of pagan and Christian objects in his tomb. More to the point, he was extremely powerful. After a gigantic battle with Northumbria in 616, Raedwald is said to have become the most powerful king south of the Humber, an estuary in England's north. That kind of implies that he was sort of big cheese, about whom people might be like, let's give this dude a fancy burial. So, the circumstantial evidence that Raedwald was buried at Sutton Hoo is pretty convincing, but we can't say for sure. Indeed, some scholars think it's more likely the king's son and successor, Earpwald, who died not long after his dad, is the one whose body once lay here before the acidic soil ate it all away. Others think that it might not have even been a king, but a highly respected warrior from the upper classes, someone who'd been indispensable to his kingdom. In fact, definitively declaring Raedwald the dude buried here becomes even harder when you realize Sutton Hoo was once filled with burial mounds, at least one of which was as big as Mound 1, but it was all lost to grave robbers. Maybe that's where Raedwald once lay, while someone else entirely lay in Mound 1. As with so much ancient and early medieval history, the simple fact may be that we'll never know for sure who the tomb at Sutton Hoo belonged to. But it almost doesn't matter. Even with Mound 1 excavated, it would soon turn out that Edith Pretty's land had a hell of a lot more treasures to offer up. The remaining Sutton Hoo artifacts were dug up during a flurry of activity over the rest of the summer 1939. With war now looming, Brown, Pretty and Phillips were forced to work against the clock, uncovering as much as possible before the apocalypse hit. On top of that, there was an ugly little legal battle to fight over who owned the grave goods, Edith Pretty or the British nation. Happily, this fight resolved itself in a pleasing way, with Pretty winning, only to then donate the entire find to the British Museum. Firstly, on September 16, 1939, 13 days after Britain declared war on Germany, Basil Brown covered the ghost image of the ship with protective bracken and quietly reburied it. And so ended the tale of the Sutton Hoo dig. Only not quite. While it contains the greatest treasure, Mound 1 wasn't the only burial site at Sutton Hoo that grave robbers had failed to excavate, and over the coming decades, the site would yield up more and more finds. Not that our heroes would be there to see it. Edith Pretty died before World War II even ended, carried off by a stroke in December of 1942. Basil Brown, on the other hand, made it all the way to 1977, passing away at the ripe old age of 89. But that was still too soon to witness the next generation of discoveries, the majority of which were uncovered in a 10-year exploration beginning in 1983. Among these, the most fascinating were the warrior and the Queen. Found in Mound 14, the Queen remains the only powerful woman known to have been buried at Sutton Hoo. While we don't actually know whether she was a queen, it's been suggested that she may have been King Redwold's wife, which would certainly explain her high-status grave. Even more interesting was the discovery of the warrior. One day in 1991, the archaeologist Martin Carver was practicing his putting on-site during a break and saw that his ball refused to settle on a gently sloped patch of land. So he did what archaeologists do, and he started digging, and below the ground he uncovered an ancient warrior who'd been buried alongside his horse. Even when this decade of digs ended in 1993, the discoveries didn't stop. Around the turn of the millennium, a second Anglo-Saxon burial ground was found nearby, this one reserved for the normal people of the Sutton Hoo society, women who were buried with beads and bowls, men buried with just a shield and spear. While lacking the wow factor of earlier discoveries, it opened yet another window into this distant era. This time, not only the lives of the rich and powerful, but onto that of ordinary people with all their wonderfully ordinary dreams and desires. Today, over 80 years after Edith Pretty first wondered what might be buried on her land, we're still coming to grips with the riches of Sutton Hoo. About 1/3 of the site is yet to be investigated, meaning all sorts of treasures could still be found, from fragments of pottery to graves as replete with treasures as Mound 1. Certainly, this is an exciting prospect, a wealth of potential finds squirreled away underground, waiting to be uncovered and again rewrite history. Yet even if the best is still to come, or even if there's nothing much of general interest left, Sutton Hoo has already earned its place in history. From these damp fields came one of those rare finds that upends how we think about the past, a discovery on par with Turkey's Göbekli Tepe. It makes you think, doesn't it? What else could be out there, in the earth, just waiting to be uncovered? What might be the next Sutton Hoo that transforms our knowledge of some forgotten era? Because if one thing is certain, it's that history is full of surprises, and 8 decades ago at Sutton Hoo, the world uncovered one of the greatest, most pleasing surprises of them all. So I really hope you found this video interesting. If you did, please do hit that thumbs up button below. Don't forget to subscribe, and as always, thank you for watching.